Shall I film you as well?
So I'm going to take what, 5 minutes, and then you're going to have 5 minutes. Is that
Okay, 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
Fine. Thank you. It's all right. It's all right.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Right.
Come on, bro. We need
No, I don't want the ladder.
Why are you scared to
Let's just crack on.
Come on, Mansur, get on the ladder. Let's go. 5 minutes.
You did not give me the book, and you want me to go on the ladder.
How do you trust him with the ladder?
You trust me with your ladder?
You can have the ladder, but we're not giving you the book.
Hey!
I want you to get on the ladder. They all want to see him. Do you want to
I
see
have
him?
a book at home.
Get on the ladder. Let's have a proper debate. No, I'm not giving the book.
Okay, now.
Go ahead.
Okay, listen. Now.
1 second, brother. Why you picked on her, you didn't pick on him? Because she's a woman. She's a woman.
She knows a lot more than almost all you guys know.
Let the man go.
Hey, good for our women! They can run circles around you, man! Go ahead, Mansur. We're giving you 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Right. What Jay does not tell anyone. Okay, stop properly. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalam. What Jay Smith does not tell us is this: the book in his hands is called The Life of Muhammad. Sirat Rasulullah of Ibn Ishaq, translated by Gillam. What he doesn't tell you is this: there is no such manuscript of Ibn Ishaq which this book is translated from.
Thank you.
Hang on, don't interrupt. I didn't even have my 5 minutes, let alone 30 seconds he's interrupting.
Carry on.
Are you going to let me finish?
But when I talk, you're all going to interrupt. Just get used to it.
Did I interrupt you?
You're going to all interrupt when I talk. Wait and see.
Jay,
You
don't worry.
don't interrupt me when
Go
I'm
ahead, you
speaking.
have 5 minutes,
and
I'm
I won't
timing you.
interrupt.
Go ahead.
5 minutes starts now. Okay. So this translation by Alfred Gillam is based on what? Secondary sources mainly. Many sources. He lists them. Listen. Now you're interrupting. Your friend Beth is interrupting. So tell her to be quiet.
So stop being a little tweak. Get quiet.
No, I'm not
If you've
gonna
got a
talk.
problem with interruption,
No, don't worry.
listen to what I have to go through every week. Get used to it. Go on.
If you are really interested in this dialogue, tell your friend who was on the ladder 2 weeks ago, something like this, with you. So she is with you, right? So ask her not to speak while we're speaking.
What
Thank
is your
you.
problem? Get on with it.
My problem is
The woman hurts you. I know she bothers you. Now get on with it.
No.
Hurry up.
Right.
What are you trying to say?
So Alfred Gillam, so Gillam has actually listed in a page the sources of his Ibn Ishaq. So it wasn't a particular manuscript of Ibn Ishaq that he's translated all of them. He's getting from Ibn Sa'd, Tabaqat Ibn Sa'd, he's getting from Tabari, he's getting from others, Waqidi maybe, Musa bin Uqba and various others. So now we realize that this is what? A compilation of later sources and presenting this as the work of Ibn Ishaq, which has been preserved on those late sources. Right, so now we realize the same author or translator actually says Ibn Ishaq isn't the first author of the Sirah. He has other people who has other people writing it. I was going to show it from this book, but they're so afraid for you to know. So for example, we know the companions, many of the companions, Abdullah ibn Abbas, who died 78 Hijrah, he had books on Sirah. Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As, Bara bin Azib, Sahal bin Hafma. Now this book is preserved in the later works in Baladhri, in Ibn Sa'd, in Tabari and Waqidi. So we have earlier books than Ibn Ishaq. Point number one. But is it the only one? No. We have even the Tabi'un. You know what Tabi'uns are? Tabi'in, the students of the companions of the Prophet. So they heard these messages and narrations and events from the companions of the Prophet. Who are they? Aban bin Uthman bin Affan, who died in 101, 105 after Hijri. This is preserved. His Sirah is preserved in the Muwatta of Malik, in Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, in Tarikh al-Tabari, in Tarikh Yaqubi. We have also Urwa bin al-Zubair bin al-Awwam, died 94 Hijrah. It is also been published by Mustafa al-Azmi. So we now have Sirah works. You said, give me anything earlier than Ibn Ishaq, I have given you enough. So you are talking about something that makes no sense, only since it makes it you're ignorant of those works.
Okay, you have 5 minutes. Here we go. Have you noticed everything that he has just said to you, all those names, are they extant today? Are any of their writings in existence today? Do we have the Muwatta? Who do we have who talks about the Muwatta? Who do we have who talks about Ibn As? Who is it that quotes them? Ibn Hisham, Al-Tabiri, Al-Waqidi. Look and see the names, the ones that wrote it down. When did Al-Waqidi die? 835. When did Ibn Hisham die? 833. When did Al-Tabari die? 923. How many years after Muhammad do all these men die? 200 to 300 years later. If these did come from these men, why were they not preserved? Why is it we don't have Ibn Abbas and his original writings? And why even Al-Waqidi? We only have the Maghazi documents, the earliest of the Sirah documents. We don't have anything earlier than that. Folks, can you see the problem? Everything they're dependent on is what the 9th and 10th century people assume the others had written. Now remember, even Ibn Hisham tells us that Ibn Ishaq, who died in 765, was the first to compile all these down. He didn't trust an awful lot of what Ibn Ishaq said. He didn't even know. He didn't get it from Ibn Ishaq. He got it from one of his students. And he threw out most of it and only retained a little bit. Al-Bukhari was given 600,000 of these writings that he's referring to in 850 to 870. And those intervening 20 years, he threw out 98% of it and only retained 2% of it. 7,397 out of 600,000. So why did he throw away 98% of it? Because he believed they were fraudulent. They were weak. They were not at all authoritative. How does he know any of it was authoritative? Did he live when the Prophet Muhammad lived? Did he hear the Prophet Muhammad speak? Did he even know the Prophet Muhammad? Did he come from the same century? No. What about the century after? No. He comes from the 9th century, 240 years later. Everything they are dependent on what Ibn Abbas said, or any of the companions said, is only what Al-Bukhari, or Ibn Hisham, or Al-Waqidi, or Al-Tabari decided what was authoritative. Now here's the question. If these men had written them as early as you're saying, why didn't they preserve them? Could they not read or write? Remember, according to your traditions, Islam controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo by 642. That's 10 years after your prophet's death. These are literate cities. These are sophisticated cities. You have controlled those cities, except for Jerusalem, even till today. For 1,400 years, you've controlled those cities. Why could you not preserve what the prophet did and what the prophet said? Why is it that suddenly they all get lost within 200 years and nothing is preserved until Ibn Hisham writes it down, Al-Waqidi writes it down, Al-Bukhari writes it down in 870, Al-Tabari writes it down in 923. That's the question we're asking, because we know Jesus did live. We know that there were biographies written about him.
1 minute to go.
We know that those who wrote down what Jesus did and what he said actually knew Jesus. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses to what they wrote.
Really?
Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. So which are you going to trust?
Really?
The eyewitness account, 30 to 40, at the most 60 years after Jesus, written by those who knew Jesus, or Muhammad, 200 to 300 years after Muhammad. None of them knew Muhammad. None of them were living at that time. Who are you going to go with?
Jesus.
What's his name?
Jesus.
Jesus. That's why it's
agree
so
with him.
important that you ask these historical questions.
10 seconds, Jay.
It's the late
10
dates
seconds.
that we're having a problem with. Now we're going to go look and see what happened in the 7th century to see if these guys got it
Shut
correct.
up.
Right, thank you very much for this enlightening waffling. You see,
5 years, not 5 minutes.
ignorance is not a bliss. Ignorance is not a bliss. Remember, I came into the point, at what point? He was talking about, give me a seerah before Ibn Ishaq. His Ibn Ishaq that he's trying to tell us is actually compilations from later works. So he's happy with that. So I came along and did the same thing that he demands us of, which he uses. From preserved in later works, but actually they were written earlier. I gave many names, right? I gave many names which are even earlier than Ibn Ishaq. He somehow missed that altogether. So he doesn't even understand the response that is provided to him. It's very sad. But anyway, so the point is taken. Ibn Ishaq's seerah is not the earliest. He wasn't the first one, neither was Ibn Hisham the first one to compile the seerah. There was various others. How do we know them? Because their works are preserved in other extant later sources, just like
There
Ibn
you
Ishaq's.
go.
Excuse me, don't talk.
No interrupting, Jay, please.
Just like
Say
Ibn
apologise.
Ishaq's works are preserved in other works, so is other writers' works preserved, and some of them I mentioned. I'm not going to repeat the point. Now he talked about Bukhari and so on. I'm not sure why he's talking about Bukhari. We have the teachers of Bukhari, or Bukhari didn't just write it from his own memory. How did Bukhari write? He told us where he got this information from. He gets his information from his teacher, who gets his information from his teacher, all the way back to the Prophet. So we have a chain of transmission. What we have, which he knows but he will not tell you, we have even other compilations earlier than Bukhari. Sahifa Hammam ibn Munabbi, an example of this document. And we can compare, and we see scholars have compared it. Professor Muhammad Hamidullah has written a book on this, comparing those things from the manuscripts. You can see it, but you want to be unaware of it. It's called selective ignorance. So we have earlier than Bukhari this material, and we can see how they have been preserved from Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu, the companion of the Prophet.
Yes.
Okay, now did Bukhari just throw out 98% of his works? No. This is another propaganda style lie from this gentleman. I'm sorry to say that. Bukhari was writing, as he says in his introduction, a mukhtasar, a small treatise, an abridgment of all that's there, but he's going to apply the strictest criteria to present this. He has also written other works in which he was lax from this criteria, Adab al-Mufrad of Bukhari. These are not all of them found in his Bukhari. And yet we found that he's actually using them. So this is Adab al-Mufrad. I'm sure you know this book, perhaps you haven't ever heard of this. So Bukhari, even himself, he compiled other books, which is not a strict criteria that he used in his Sahih. He didn't throw them out, he didn't say they're fraudulent. What an ignorant remark. He never said these are fraudulent, because these in his criteria doesn't come up to the standard of absolute Sahih, but they can be Hasan, which is still acceptable. Hasan is perfectly acceptable, and there are many hadiths like that. So he was not going about collecting all and throwing all away. Now this is a myth. Professor Mustafa Al-Azami, in his book, Studies in Early Hadith Literature, actually talking about all these things. You have seen it, you have read it, but you just laugh it away. I would like interested readers to go and read these sections from a muhaddis, a scholar of hadith, who explained this from the words of Bukhari. And if you don't want to do that, you want to go into Islamic Awareness website, you can do that. Now let's go back to the issues of trustworthiness of the books and documents. He is having difficulty in accepting other works, like I mentioned, right? Some of them I mentioned earlier than Ibn Ishaq, but he's happy to accept this book, which he's not happy to lend me, because see that Ibn Ishaq. He's happy to use that. But yet, the same methodology when we use and we find earlier works, he doesn't want to use that. Now, I have never seen, in fact, in my experience, Christians are being consistent at all. So inconsistent. Talking about manuscripts and documentation. If this is going to create doubt in your faith, that how can I believe in it? It's so much removed, 200 years and so on. Let's talk about very quickly the Old Testament. The earliest manuscript of the Old Testament is what? From the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are 1,400 years away from when Moses, the prophet, peace be upon him, wrote. How long? The earliest extant available manuscripts of the Torah is 1,400 years old. I am sure Jay is going to be consistent and throw it away and say, I cannot trust it. I am doubtful. I am skeptical that this is actually the Torah of Moses.
Okay, very good. You know, he hasn't answered the question I asked. Let me repeat it again, and Mansur, I want you to respond to this. If these were all written down in the 7th century, as you claim, where are they today? Show me one manuscript. Show me one siddha from the 7th century, from the companions, not only from the companions, but from the century that Muhammad lived. Show me why none of them exist today. And why is it you have to wait 240 years to finally get it written down, compiled? I'm sure they claim, and I'm sure they quote many of the companions. They say they come from those companions. But what was their criteria? You're not telling the people their criteria. It was the chain of names. Isnad, was it not? So-and-so got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the companion of the Prophet. What does that tell us? That is oral tradition. Therefore, everything that not only Hisham and Waqidi and Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, Tirmidhi, and also Tabari, all of them are based on oral tradition. The fact that you cannot show me any written documents shows me it's nothing more than what the 9th and 10th century people believed happened in the 7th century. And that's the problem I'm having. Because when you look and see who and what it talks about, when you look at the Quran, when you look at the geographical names, the geographical places in the Quran, take a look and see where these geographical places exist. 65 references to geographical places in the Quran.
Name them.
Over and over again. 24 times it talks about the people from Thamud. 23 times it refers to the people from Ad. 7 times it refers to the people from Midian. It mentions that this place where the Prophet lived, notice, it only mentions the Prophet name 4 times. But it refers over and over again to this messenger, this Prophet, who lives in this place. It only mentions once where this place is. And it mentions in Surah 48, Ayah 24, that this is in Mecca. Isn't that interesting? If it's such an important city, why is it only mentioned once in the Quran? But hold on a minute. It mentions that this city is in a valley with a parallel valley. It has trees, clay, low. It has olive trees. It has a stream going through it. Folks, take a look at Mecca and see if that at all parallels what we now know exists in Mecca. Not at all. And also, if this prophet has so much contact with these people from Ad 23 times, the people from Thamud 24 times, the people from Midian 7 times, look and see where these people live. They don't live near Mecca. They're 600 miles further north. 600 miles too far north. But what really is damaging, take a look and see what is up 600 miles further north. Look and see what fits almost every description we see in the Quran. What city does exist 600 miles further north that is surrounded by Thamud and Ad and Midian? What city is in a valley with a parallel valley with a stream going through it? What city does have clay, low? And what city does have olive trees? Petra is the only city that fits what we see in the Quran. What's even more interesting, take a look at all the mosques that are now being looked at, not the mosques today, but the mosques that are the ancient floor plans. Look at the ancient floor plans for the mosques that are in Jordan, the mosques that are in Syria, the mosques that are in Yemen, the mosques that are in Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, even the Dome of the Rock, the whole citadel, as far away as Guangzhou in China. Look at where they're facing. Every one of them is facing Petra up until 725 AD. That's 100 years almost after Muhammad. Every mosque is facing Petra. Now, one of them is facing Mecca. Now, that should show you you've got a problem. See, that's why we're questioning your traditions. No wonder they're written so late. They've got the wrong man in the wrong place, at the wrong time, amongst the wrong people. Now, folks, I'm giving you historical material, and that's why we're asking this today. Show me how you can discern that.
Right. Very interesting again, what we called this quack theories. Oh, Mecca didn't exist. It wasn't in Mecca as we know it. Somehow the Prophet and all the people, the Quraysh specifically, the custodians of the Kaaba, they were living in Petra. And there's a huge conspiracy. All the Muslims, every single one of them, the Muslim historians, the Muslim muhaddithin, the people who write hadith and the people who write biography, everyone somehow conspired all together to say Islam didn't begin in Petra, it began in Mecca. Now, he talked about all these references. Do you know where he gets this from? He gets this from some of his friends, like Dan Gibson. We'll talk about who Dan Gibson is, and his book, The Quranic Geography, in a minute. That's where he's coming from. I'm sure he hasn't even read it himself, and the evidence that is there presented within it. So now, let's come back. Now, so let's talk about what the Quran talks about the geography. The Quran talks about As-Safa and Marwa. The Quran talks about Badr and Hunayn. Now, Jay would like to tell us, Safa, Marwa, Badr and Hunayn, as the Quran mentions them, actually they're in Petra. And his friend Tom Holland, he's actually seen those places in Petra. Or Dan Gibson, actually from space maybe, he's seen it in Petra, right? Hunayn, Badr, yes? Safa and Marwa, continuous living memory of the people. They don't associate the Badr is in China or in Petra. Badr is in Badr. Hunayn is in Hunayn. Safa and Marwa in Safa and Marwa in Mecca. So your quack theories doesn't count, my friend. Historical living testimony of the people, of course you don't understand. So now, as we realize now, Quran doesn't only talk about this. In fact, what he didn't say is like this. Oh, the reason why we know it talks about Petra, because there's a verse in the Quran which talks about the story of Lot. You pass them by morning and evening. What a mistranslation of this so-called dishonest evangelist scholars of yours. If you read this verse, it tells you, you pass them in the morning and also at night. This was the habit of the people at that time. When they're going to visit them, they either travel at morning or they'll travel at night. So it has nothing to do with their times of travel to mean, oh, because they pass by in the morning or pass by in nighttime, it means this area is in Petra. What a joke it is. It's a quack theory, nothing less than that. Now, coming back to this issue. You know, Qibla of the mosques. Does he even know the latitude and longitude of the mosques? Is he even aware that there's a Qibla wall or the mihrab niche? Can he even point? Okay, what scholarly work can you actually demonstrate? Not from my Tom, Dick and Harry book, who's written a book, you know? Anyone can write a book and publish. So now, which scholar have said that, oh, this particular mosque faces towards Petra. This particular mosque faces away towards the north to Jerusalem. You had Patricia Croner earlier on. He's changed his views. He doesn't like Patricia Croner anymore. Do you know why? Because Patricia Croner has changed a lot of her views. And he doesn't like that anymore. That's why he changed it to say, okay, oh, I want Dan Gibson, excuse me. I want Dan Gibson. I like Dan because he's now talking about Petra, not Jerusalem anymore. We showed the calculations, the historical references in our website, IslamicAwareness.org, on the issues of Qibla orientation of early mosques. In Wasit, Kufa, Fustat, all of those in mosques in Cairo. Why? Showing how the earlier Muslims, before the first 200 years, they aligned their Qibla based on what? Is it the winter sunrise or summer sunset? Or is it to do the equinox? Or is it to do what? Is it just guesswork? Because the prophetic tradition says the Qibla is between east and the west. So Muslims used this as their reference point. And then they used the wall of the Kaaba, which is closely aligning to where it was. Right? Is it the winter sunrise or not? We have shown an article many years back for your reference. But he selectively ignores to understand the article. Even though the references, all the evidence is there, from David, King and others. Quoting clearly the basis of Qibla determination. You come up with this quack theory by Dan Gibson, who says, oh, I have seen an aerial photograph. Do you even know the original floor plan? Do you even know where the wall is? Do you even know where the mihrab is? Which mosques? The mosques that were built and rebuilt again? How can you say these are the original floor plans? You're coming up with the floor plans, the mosques which are currently existing, and say, oh, this is how it used to be. Not only that, I challenge you to show me in latitudes and longitudes of every single mosques that you are quoting from Dan Gibson to say how many degrees away are they from Mecca. Do that.
I love this. It's obviously you've not read Dan Gibson's book.
You have.
Otherwise you would get the answer. In fact, Dan Gibson confronted Islamic awareness on this very notion. Look at page 235. Read it before you start making these accusations.
What did he say?
Because Dan Gibson answers every one of these. He says, you guys are waffling when you talk about the southern solstice and the winter solstice. That means it's two different directions. But for heaven's sakes, look and see where they're directed. And he's not looking at modern mosques. He purposely did not look at modern mosques because mosques have been destroyed and rebuilt many times. He's looking at the original floor plan. And it's not just Dan Gibson.
Where is the floor
Dr.
plan?
Creswell.
Where is
Dr.
the-
Fahadvani, are you going to interrupt me now so I can interrupt you?
Sorry, carry on.
Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fahadvani noticed this back in 1905. This has been around for over 100 years. They noticed that the mosques were not facing Mecca. Now, they were erroneous. They thought it was Jerusalem. They were off by 3 degrees. They should have done their homework better. Thank God Dan Gibson did it for them. And that's why he has looked at every one. And here's what's interesting. It's not that some were facing this way and some were facing that way to follow a solstice, a summer and a winter solstice. They were all uniformly facing Petra up until 725. Including as far away as in Guangzhou in China. That's what's damaging. And then after 725, between 725 and 822, 50% of them finally start facing Mecca. 17% still are facing Petra. So there's a confusion, especially in North Africa. None of them in North Africa are facing either Petra or Mecca. It's not till 822 that every mosque then faces Mecca. Muhammad died in 632. Look at your math. It takes them 200 years to finally get it right. And that's why we're asking this question. But you still haven't answered the question I asked before. Why is it, if this man Muhammad is so important, if he's the greatest of all men, greatest of all prophets, the seal of all the prophets, the man that brought the final revelation, why did no one write down his biography in the century where he lived and preserve it till today? Why is it that no one wrote his sayings down in the century where he lived or the century after he lived? Why is it you cannot preserve something as important as that when we can preserve 4 testimonies of Jesus Christ from the 1st century? Folks, that's why we're asking this question. You can no longer say that these men, it's not important that they didn't write it down in manuscripts that we can still see today. What I will suggest and what I'm saying is that when it was finally written down by Ibn Ishaq, al-Waqidi, 200 years after the fact, by al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, 240 years after the fact, by al-Tabari, Tirmidhi, Ibn Dawud, and many others, 300 years after the fact, when they finally wrote down, they quoted all these men, none of which have any authenticity because none of them have any written documentation to support any of their claims. You cannot get away with that, Muslims. You cannot ask us to believe something that is only based on oral tradition.
Why not?
Look what happens to oral tradition. I tell her something, she tells him, he tells him. By the time it gets back to me, after 15 minutes, it's 2 different comments. Can you imagine 200 years of oral tradition, which nothing is written down? Why is it, therefore, that we do not trust al-Bukhari and the traditions, that we're going back to the 7th century, and what we're finding out about the 7th century does not fit what we see today, nor does it fit what the 9th and 10th century people say happened. That's why we're asking this question. But when you come to Jesus Christ, and you look and see what he did, you look and see what he said, almost everything the gospel writers said about Jesus has the right man in the right place at the right time, doing the right things. So who is more trustworthy? Jesus! What is his name? Jesus! Oh, I love that name, folks. That's the historical question you should be answering. You can answer the historical question about Jesus, but you cannot do the same about Muhammad. I give it over to you.
Right. Did you notice one thing? I talked about being consistent. I raised the point about documentation and oral memory. I talked about specifically the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah of Moses, and I highlighted that the Christians and the Jewish people do not have a text which is preserved of the Old Testament or the Torah, but they do have which is 1,400 years later. So gap of 1,400 years. He is so happy to accept that. He's so happy to accept that this is okay. Even though it's 1,400 years, I believe in it and I accept it. But when according to his own admissions, let's say now, for sake of argument, it's a mistaken argument, all the Quran on the Hadith is 200, 300 years later. So compared to the Old Testament, the Torah, 1,400 years and 300 years. He cannot accept anything 300 years, but he can accept 1,400 years gap.